welcome Vivek, because it's just wonderful to have him with us. He's a very distinguished public servant. He was Surgeon General under President Obama, and then really significantly reappointed by President Biden. So he's got this extraordinary responsibility for the public health of 340 million Americans. Unlike many doctors, he's got a very, very wide view of health. In fact, the one that I think that the WHO promotes. And in between his two periods as Surgeon General, he wrote a wonderful book, Together, Loneliness, Health, and What Happens When We Find Connection. And I just want to read you, this was sentence struck me so strongly near the front of the book. To my surprise, the topic of emotional well-being in general and loneliness in particular received the strongest response from the public of any issues I worked on as Surgeon General. I mean, that's an extraordinary statement. And it's led him in his second tour of office to issue an advisory document as Surgeon General on how the American people should tackle loneliness. So Vivek, why don't we start with some medicine? So tell us the effect of loneliness on physical and mental health.
Absolutely. Well, let me just first make sure. Can everyone hear me? Just want to make sure the mics are working. Great. I just want to say thank you to Richard for being a wonderful friend, a phenomenal leader in this space, and somebody who, as I was telling him about before, and I'll try not to embarrass him, but was an inspiration to me long before I met him. And in 2018, when we met in person at a conference here in the UK, it was like meeting somebody who was larger than life. So it's just a privilege for me to be able to have this conversation with you.
Privilege for me.
This issue, Richard, as you were mentioning, was not one that I thought I would work on. When I first started my first tenure as Surgeon General under President Obama, I had a whole long list of topics that I was going to work on that would be no surprise to any of you who are in public health. They included obesity, the addiction crisis, and on the list went. But it became very clear to me when I was traveling around our country and talking to communities about how I could be helpful, that these stories and experiences of loneliness became extremely, they were very common. They came up all the time. What was interesting is people didn't use this word, though, lonely, to talk about how they felt. They would describe it in other terms that will probably be familiar to many of us, even in thinking about conversations we've had with friends and family. So they'd say things like, I feel like if I disappeared tomorrow, it wouldn't even matter. No one would care. No one would notice. Or they would say, I've got all these burdens that I have to carry on my life. So much is on my shoulders, but I've got to bear it all alone. There's nobody to help me. And I would hear from young people in particular on college campuses and universities who would say to me, I'm on campus and I'm surrounded by all of these other students, but nobody really knows me. And I feel like I can't be myself. And I don't like that. I feel like I'm on my own. And so in different ways, using different words, people were telling this story of loneliness, which is how I came to realize that there was something happening here. That was my first clue that there was a broader public health issue here. But it was digging into the science around it, to your question, that really made me realize this is an issue we've got to tackle as a public health priority, not just one of 50, 60, 70, 80 issues that hopefully we'll get around to at some point in the future, but actually is a foundational issue that impacts everything else. So what I was finding in the data and the research, and this is what we published, in fact, in our 2023 Surgeon General's Advisory on loneliness and isolation, is that when people were struggling with this sense of disconnection, social disconnection from one another, it actually increased their risk of depression, anxiety, and suicide. But this even more striking part was that it increased their risk of physical illness as well. So a 29% increase in the risk of heart disease, 31% increase in the risk of stroke, a 50% increase in the risk of dementia among older individuals. And on the list went. There was an increase in premature death as well. and the risk of actually increased mortality that we were seeing with social disconnection was comparable to the risk of mortality with smoking. It was even greater than the mortality risk that we were seeing with obesity, with sedentary living. I mention these in particular because obesity, sedentary living, and smoking, we think of these as classic public health issues. Yet the data was so striking to me that showed us that loneliness is just as important as those issues and has to be just as much a priority. So that's ultimately what led me to focus on it. And I'll lastly say that the impact is not just on the individual, but social disconnection has profound impacts on societies at large. What we were finding is that when you looked at schools and academic performance, that was negatively impacted by social disconnection. When you looked at productivity in the workplace, and this is based on some interesting work out of University of Pennsylvania by the late Sigal Barsaid and by many others, productivity, creativity, and engagement in the workplace were all negatively affected when people did not feel strongly connected to other people at work. And then even if, just talk about a problem that many of us are seeing in our countries around the world, polarization and division, we might think, well, that's just a political problem. No, it's not. It turns out that that's also very much linked to how connected people feel to one another. The simple example being when you go home for the holiday and you're around the table, the dinner table for Christmas, let's say, with other family members, you may have family members who you vehemently disagree with on political issues or other issues. Everyone has that crazy uncle or crazy aunt, as they say, who has wacky views. But the truth is, if that uncle or aunt was in an accident and ended up in the hospital, you'd probably show up. If you were hurt and in desperate need of help, they would probably show up for you. Because what relationships help us see is that we are more than our view on a particular issue. We are more than one statement that we may make and post on social media. But we are human beings who are complex, who have the capacity to love and be loved, to show up for one another, to develop and build trust. And without relationships, you cannot have trust. Without trust, you cannot have a functional society, and you devolve into division and polarization, which makes it not just hard to function day to day, but in the face of adversity, like a once-in-a-lifetime, hopefully once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, like what we saw with COVID, instead of coming together, communities fracture, right? And unfortunately, that's a lot of what we saw. So this is why, I've come to believe that this is a critical issue for mental health, physical health, but also for the health of society.
Great. Now, people sometimes say this is rising, but what are the facts about it? Is it rising? And if it's rising as a problem, why is it rising?
Yeah, so this is one of these areas where we actually have some data, not enough data, to truly understand the deeper trends here. And one of the things that we have certainly called for in our advisory has been a greater focus on metrics and data collection across the world to better understand these trends and specifically which groups are most impacted. This is one place where I just want to give credit and kudos to the United Kingdom, actually, for its phenomenal leadership and work on advancing the issue of social connection and loneliness long before other governments were really paying attention to it. But not only appointing, a cabinet level minister to focus on this issue, but actually developing the first national strategy to address loneliness has been really vital. And a key part of that strategy was focused on metrics, and I think appropriately so. But even from the evidence that we have, we do see some concerning trends. In the US, for example, we have seen that loneliness among young people has increased every year for the last several decades. We've seen also that when you track the amount of in-person time that people have with others, with friends, with family, that has been steadily declining. In the 17 years or so, between 2003 and 2020, there was a 70% decrease in the amount of in-person time that young people in America had with their friends. That's 77-0, not 1-7. That's a dramatic decline. When you look across the board, across all ages, there was a net decrease in 24 hours in terms of the amount of time per month that people spend in person with their friends and family members and others. And so there are a number of indicators like this that are telling us that people are becoming more isolated. The last number I'll mention has to do just with how much time we are spending online in front of our phones. And you might say, well, sometimes when we're on our phone, we're connecting with people on social media. But we have now like more and more evidence, including from some recent studies, that tell us something, frankly, that I think we all intrinsically know, which is that in-person time and online time are just different in terms of the quality of our connections, right? And I think the pandemic actually gave us a front view seat to that, right? When we shifted dramatically, all of a sudden, all of our meetings to online meetings, instead of in-person meetings, when we couldn't see each other in person and we're catching up with friends on the phone. It was nice. Technology is helpful, right, to be able to have at least some connection. But we know that as a complete substitute, that it fell short. It was insufficient. And so when in the United States, our recent data is telling us that adolescents are spending on average, this is on average, 4.8 hours a day on social media. That is not time doing homework, their computer. It's not time, just looking for information, on non-social media platforms to help them with their work. This is specifically on social media. So part of the question is, if you're spending 4.8 hours a day on average, what are you not doing, right? Well, I'll tell you, you're not doing is you're not spending that time in person with others. It's also, what you're not doing is you're not sleeping as much, because in the US, we find a third of adolescents are actually staying up till midnight or later on weeknights on their devices. And a lot of that is actually social media use. And this is critical for adolescents because we know when they're sleep deprived, it increases their risk for mental health concerns. So I think these indicators, even though the data is not perfect, tell us that there may be there are concerning trends here in terms of our time. And lastly, to your question, Richard, about what's driving it, and we've spoken about a little bit of this. I do think that the increasing presence, and in some cases, a dominant presence of technology, in particular social media, in our lives, and particularly in the young people's lives, I think are taking us away from in-person interaction. But I think that the other piece that's happening online is not just a substitution effect per se, but it's also the actual impact of what is taking place online, which is many young people tell me, and this comes up in surveys all the time, that their experience online when it's on social media actually has a negative effect on their self-esteem, right? Now, the caveat here, if you look at the data, is it's not to say that there are no benefits at all that young people get from social media. There's some benefits they can get in terms of reconnecting with old friends, finding communities of shared experience that they otherwise may not have had in person, being able to express themselves creatively. But a lot of this is perhaps a balance. And as all of us know, that with any new technology, new tool, whether it's a car or social media, you're trying to balance risks and benefits. And what I'm saying here is that that risk-benefit ratio is very much off. It is heavily skewed. And from too many young people in particular, it is skewed toward negative effects. And we see and hear this all the time. I just finished a college tour that we were doing in the United States, a university tour, talking to young people all across America. And I will tell you that in every single conversation that I had, social media came up as a point of concern for young people, where the conversation would usually start with, I'm on social media, I like, being on it because, I get to reconnect with old friends. But the truth is, I always feel worse about myself. I'm constantly comparing myself to other people when I'm using social media. And I also feel that it's hard for me to get off it. That I stay up late, I don't go to see friends, I'm in the dining hall, but I'm on my devices all the time. One of the most concerning things that I found when we were traveling to universities was actually how quiet it was. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I remember when I was in university, it was not quiet. People were loud, and the loudest place was the dining hall, right? Because we'd all be done with our classes for the day, you come and pile into the dining hall, and you're just talking about everything that happened. But what was really disturbing to me is that there's not as much talking because people are on their devices. They've got their earbuds in, they're looking at their laptops. And students at university after university said to me, how are we supposed to start a conversation when that's just not the culture anymore to talk to one another? So just think about that for a moment, that statement, because it came up everywhere. They were saying it's not the culture to talk to one another anymore. That is a powerful statement. And it's an indictment of the trends that we've seen recently, because if the culture is not to talk to one another anymore, then we dramatically need to shift the culture to once again build a culture of connection. So I think a combination of both technology and social media, combined with the fact that over time we have moved around more and disconnected and from communities, combined with the fact that, at least in the United States, and this is true, I think, increasingly in other countries too, that we have seen in the last 4 or 5 decades a decrease in participation in the organizations that used to bring us together, from faith organizations, churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, to recreational organizations, to service organizations. You put all that together with the fact that it just hasn't been a stated, clear priority for us to maintain connection. And you come to the situation we're in now. And the last part I mentioned is important because it's not that there is some lobby out there that is trying to promote loneliness, right? Like, this is not like somebody's objective. But sometimes things happen when we don't fiercely protect the things that we care about and that are important to us. And 40, 50 years ago, maybe we didn't have to fiercely protect it as much because there weren't as many forces pulling us apart from one another. But the world is shifting and changing. And I think what we are seeing is that if we don't identify our relationships to one another as both an individual and societal priority, if we don't fight to protect and preserve and grow those connections, then we will get lonelier and lonelier. And that's unfortunately what we're seeing now.
Well, it's a very worrying situation, isn't it? So what can be done about it? And in particular, what can public authorities do about it? So you've issued your advisory, I think about a year ago. What effects has that had?
Well, I think this is the right question. And one thing I've realized, Richard, is that to really address an issue like loneliness, this is something that all of us have to engage on. And that means private sector, businesses and schools, it means individuals, and it means government too. I think I always tell people in the general public that loneliness is not going to be solved by a law being passed, but it also requires the government to take certain steps, and many of those we lay out in our advisory. Here are some of them. I think from a government perspective, the government has actually a unique role that it can play in highlighting and drawing attention to issues as ones of national and global priority. That is something that the private sector cannot do alone. The second thing the government can do is deploy resources, material resources, to both advancing our research and understanding of how to build social connections, what interventions work, which groups are most at risk, but can also deploy resources to supporting what I think of as social infrastructure in our communities. Now, we're used to thinking about built infrastructure in terms of sidewalks and roads and highways, but the social infrastructure in our lives are the policies and structures and programs that actually allow for the building of healthy relationships. And so those could be programs in communities that actually allow people to come together and get to know one another. Those could be support for recreational leagues that bring folks together, support for faith communities and other organizations that create spaces for folks to gather. That kind of infrastructure is important. Additionally, one last thing I'll mention about government is that there are many policies that government may enact and implement in transportation, in education, in health, in other realms, that has unintended impacts on our ability to connect, right? Nobody in any department in government, in any aspect of public policy making, would argue with the fact that cost, for example, should be something we all consider. It doesn't matter if I'm making education policy, health policy, housing policy, I have to mind cost. The same actually should be true, I think, when it comes to social connection, given that all of these policies have impacts. Think about policies that carve up our cities and towns with highways and roadways and separate us from one another. Think about the power of policy to actually put public transportation in place to bring people back together once again. Think about housing, which can, the way it's designed, can have a powerful impact on how people come together or whether they don't. Think also about education, right? In education, we've long said that the goal of education is to teach people how to, at least in the United States for years, like how to read, write, and do arithmetic, right? They just called those the 3 R's, right? I know arithmetic doesn't start with an R, but it's all about pronunciation. So. But I think increasingly, if the thing we have to think about it is if the goal of education is to give children a foundation for living a healthy and fulfilling life, to use a term that Richard was underscoring, if the goal of education is to give young people a foundation for well-being, then that means that giving young people tools for building healthy relationships, for managing conflict, for understanding their emotions and the emotions of others should be a priority, right? And so thinking about how social connection is impacted by policy and how to shape policy to enhance social connection across government is really vital. I'll actually just give you one anecdote that I always remember in my head because it reminds me of the importance of these programs. Now, I visited a school once in the United States, in the state of Connecticut, and it was a school that actually had a program to help young people understand how to think about their emotions, how to process and manage their emotions, but also how to manage and build on the emotions of other people around them. And so if you think about grade school, I suspect we all have our unique experiences, but in the United States, we call middle school grades 6, 7, and 8, or standard 6, 7, and 8. And for many people, that's a very painful time in their educational experience. You know, kids are growing, the adolescence is starting, kids often bully each other, they're not so kind. It's not an easy time. So I go to this school, right, where I'm talking to 5th, 6th graders. And they have this integrated curriculum where the social and emotional learning is actually woven into all of their classes. It's not some special class out there. It's just recognized that when I'm learning English, history, whatever it is, that there are threads here that I can weave in and help people understand the emotional dimension of life. So I happen to be talking to 3 kids about their experience. And then when I was chatting with them, all of a sudden this other kid walked behind them and they all turned around to look at him and they exchanged a knowing glance with each other and then they turned back to me. But I said, hold on, what was that all about? You were looking at that kid, what's going on there? And they said, oh, that's John. He came in this morning and he was yelling at people in class and throwing things. And we thought to ourselves, oh boy, something probably happened at home. Maybe he got into a fight with his mom. So we just let him do his thing. And then when he calmed down a little bit, at the end of class, a couple of us just went up to him and said, hey, what happened? Did you get into a fight again? And then he told us that he was, got into a fight with his mom, but now he's doing better. And then they started, continuing in the conversation. But I said, wait a minute. Just think about what just happened there. The maturity to be able to, one, see an outburst from someone, to not react with violence or with a similar outburst, but to pause and say, hold on, what's going on here? To recognize that what we do today might be affected by what happened yesterday. That's the second point. Third, to give that person grace, and to be able to say, let them settle down. Fourth, to approach that person and have a conversation, to say, are you okay? How are you doing? And fifth, to be able to follow up later and make sure they're doing okay. They did that without even thinking about it because that's what they had been taught to do, right? So that's the power. We all know adults who don't do this, right? Online every day, we see evidence of a lack of that kind of social consciousness and relationship skill, right? So I think, ultimately when it comes to what we can do as a society, it has to do with weaving these threads of connection and relationship building into our day-to-day lives. We are intellectual people. We are cerebral. We can think. We can analyze. But fundamentally, as human beings, we are also emotional creatures, right? Our emotions and our intellect exist side by side. And if we don't teach young people how to use and manage their emotions for the better, how to build healthy relationships, then especially in an environment that is challenged by social media and by a news environment that can be excessively negative, it can be incredibly difficult for young people.
I'm going to ask one more question, but after that, it's your turn. So get ready. You've been talking mainly about what public authorities can do, something about what teachers can do, but would you like to say a little more about how you think that the private world can deal with loneliness?
Well, absolutely, and I'm glad you asked that, Richard, because I do think there's a lot that the private sector can do. And it doesn't matter how big or small you are as a company, it doesn't matter how big or small you are as a nonprofit organization, but here are some things I think that really matter. One is to think internally about the people in your workforce and to ask yourself the question, do I know how connected people are in my workforce? To know that, we have to measure that to some extent, and there are ways to do that. Thankfully, there are validated scales that we can use to measure loneliness. The other thing that we can also do is build small programs and start shaping our culture around connection in the workplace. I'll tell you, see, in the old days, I feel like the way that people built connection in the workplace was through happy hours and company picnics, right? There's nothing wrong with those things. But it's just, I don't think we're in an environment we can expect anymore that if you just throw a whole bunch of people into a room together, that they're somehow magically going to all connect and build meaningful relationships, especially in an environment where people are now in hybrid work structures and may not see each other as much. So it requires a little bit more structure and a little bit more time. But the time doesn't have to be a lot. I'll tell you about one very simple thing we do in our office, in fact. So we have something that we call our Humans of OSG exercise, and that OSG stands for Office of the Surgeon General. But the exercise is very simple. It involves asking two people during our all-staff meetings to volunteer, and for one of them to interview the other for 10 minutes. This is all it takes, 10 minutes once a week, right? And that interview could be about any dimension of their life, as long as it's not about their current job. So if I was interviewing Richard in one of these work meetings, I might ask Richard, so where did you grow up? What was it like where you grew up? Like, were you the kind of person who was introverted or extroverted? What did you dream about doing when you were a kid? What are the things that happened in your life that sort of really changed your life direction in unexpected ways? Who are the people that were heroes to you? Who showed up in unexpected ways in your life? I might just ask any number of questions just to be able to understand more about Richard and his life experience, right? And in those 10 minutes, I will tell you that we often learn more about that other person than sometimes we knew about them having worked 6 months or a year side by side them. And we feel closer to them because we've learned something about their human content. Like, we are more than our skill sets, right? We are human beings who bring a full set of life experiences. And we should not have to check all of that at the door when we walk into work. In fact, that's the glue that connects us. So that's a simple but powerful thing that companies can do. But companies can also think about the impact they're having in their communities, right? So when you, for example, sponsor recreational leagues, when companies actually make it a point to encourage their employees to participate in activities in the community, especially service activities, right? Service is one of the most powerful antidotes to loneliness and disconnection. Right? But it's one that in the United States, we've seen a decline in participation in service over recent decades. And that's one that we need to rebuild. It can be good for communities, can actually help rebuild connection as well. And finally, just consider this. I know that we've been through a very difficult pandemic that has taken an extraordinary toll in terms of human costs, financial costs, so much in people's lives. But I do believe that sometimes clarity can come out of crisis. And one of the things I'm hoping that we can become more clear on after this very difficult pandemic is just how important our relationships are to one another, how important social connection is for our well-being. And the truth is, many of us lost people during the pandemic. You know, my family lost many relatives. We lost about 10 relatives between, folks in India and folks in the United States. And it was painful. But many people have endured this kind of pain and loss or worry about people in your family who were older, who might have been at higher risk, not knowing what was going to happen to them if they were going to get sick. That all takes a toll on you. But I found during the pandemic, I was thinking a lot about my own life and how I was living my life. And I realized that I was doing something that didn't make any sense, which was if you had stopped me and asked me, if Richard had said to me, Vivek, what are your priorities, top 3 priorities in life? Like, I guarantee you I would have mentioned my wife, my kids, my dad, my mom, my sister, like in that priority list. Yet when I looked at how I was actually living my life, people were not at the center of my life. Work was at the center of my life, right? And I was fitting people in where it was convenient. If I had finished my medical training and moved to a small town in America where I didn't know a soul, didn't have any family or friends, but where they were willing to make me the chair of the department right out of training, people would have said, bravo, this is great, big move, like fantastic, go for it. If I had instead moved to a small town in America where I had lots of family and friends, but where I didn't really have great job prospects, people would have said, oh, he used to be so ambitious. I don't know what happened. It's too bad. That shows a clear priority, right, that we have in society. Yet it stands in clear distinction and contrast to the conversations that I, and I suspect others of us, have had with people at the end of their lives. Because at the end of their lives, like when I've sat with patients at the bedside and talked to them about what's mattered, people don't talk about their promotions and how much was in their bank account. and how many followers they had on Instagram. What people reflect on in those clarifying moments when only the most meaningful strands of life rise to the top is they talk about their relationships, about the time they spent with the people they loved, about the memories that they cherish with their children and their spouses and friends. They talk about the people who broke their hearts, the people they missed. We don't have to wait till the end of our lives to have that clarity. And my hope is that coming through this pandemic, that we can forge ahead in designing not only policy and programs, but our own lives in ways that center around people and relationships, because that ultimately is at the heart of what will support our happiness, our fulfillment, and our well-being.
Great. Lovely, thank you very much. Now, we're having a Q&A. Who wants to start? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Harding. I work in mental health and also public health. And I just want to say, well, first of all, I want to just take a moment and I want to just acknowledge this moment that Karen and Sarah have brought together, these two incredible minds on the stage. And Dr. Murthy, I just want to tell you how much your work means to physicians like myself, and also how incredible that we are at this point that we're able to talk about these things that really matter and look at these big picture. And I just want to say it's transformative. My question is, and I'm just so excited. It's hard to, everything about this is just so right and could really not just transform our health, but also our world, and exactly Richard's work. My question is, how do you take this from a sort of nice to have to a must have for people, for communities, to organizations? Because I know sometimes it feels like when things are good, it's an add-on, but to really make it sort of a core part of who we are, how we promote people, how we see success, all of it. So thank you.
Well, Kelly, thank you so much, and it's so nice to be here with you. I think you're asking the right question, and I think I really was thinking about what Richard said in the beginning about the economy versus well-being, and I do think that there has been this notion that it's hard indicators like jobs, wages, etc., that are the sole determinants of happiness and fulfillment. And it's not that those don't matter, those matter a lot. But I do think that well-being is increasingly important. I think that the mental health crisis that we're seeing in the United States and in the UK and in other countries, especially among youth, I think is giving us an opportunity to shift and change the conversation on what should be at the forefront of what guides us in policy making, and frankly also what guides us from a culture perspective. Because parents in particular are at their wits' end, struggling here. And I'm a parent myself. I have a 6- and 7-year-old at home, and I am worried about them, as they grow up, about the environment that they're going to be growing up in. And I think parents are hungry for a change, but also, interestingly, young people are hungry for a change too. I think one of the most powerful and important drivers of well-being is meaning in your life, and in particular, meaning that draws from forces that are bigger than ourselves. Our relationships, our sense of purpose, our engagement in service. These are three powerful sources of meaning, but many young people that we talk to all across America right now don't feel like they have a strong sense of purpose. In fact, the data is telling us that fewer and fewer young people feel like they have a strong sense of purpose. I mentioned already that service engagement is declining, and connections and loneliness, have become problems as well. But all of this means that these powerful forces outside, that are around us, that our connection to them is dwindling. But we all need to be connected to something bigger than ourselves, to feel a part of something bigger than ourselves. That's a vital source of meaning, in our lives. And that's a conversation that I'm finding people are hungry to have. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that we can wait for a group of enlightened policymakers to suddenly put this at the center. I think they have to be guided to do that by advocates, by leaders like yourself who are in the healthcare space, by people in this room, but also by the grassroots voices of parents and young people who are telling us so clearly in so many ways through stories and statistics that they want something different. Like this term, I don't know if this is used in the UK, but there's a term that Kelly will know that's used in the US called hustle culture that young people talk about all the time, right? And their fundamental question when we do roundtables with them is, what are we hustling after? What are you saying we are running toward? And I will often ask them in these roundtables, like, so what do you think hustle culture is telling you success is? What is it driving you toward? And they say some version of fame, followers, and fortune. That is what success seems to be. Fame, followers, and fortune.
Right.
And I've had too many young people say to me that like they feel like what they really got to do right now is build their brand. And they don't say it ironically, or they're just like, yeah, that's what we all got to do. We got to build our brand so we can get out there and make it, right? But intrinsically, many of them don't feel thrilled about it. Something is telling them that's not right. Like we have this thing, a policy in the United States now, which worries me, which allows college athletes to monetize, sort of their fame or their status by like, they can do ads, for example, for companies, et cetera. Now, there's nothing wrong in college students making money. There's nothing wrong with that. But so many college students that we've spoken to now say they feel pressure to build their brand. They're like, I love sports. I want to play sports in university, and I want to study, and I want to earn a degree. But now I feel like I've got to like build a brand online so that I can get these deals, endorsement deals, and I just wanted to be a student athlete. Like what's going on here? So I do think that it's not easy to do, but what we have to build is nothing less than a grassroots movement to fundamentally shift culture and policy. And the culture piece really matters, because ultimately if we don't change culture and we only change policy, it's not sustainable. Like, sadly, the world's history is littered with policies that were well intended, but were never sustained because there was never broad public support or engagement in sustaining them. And so that's part of the work that we are trying to do and to drive in the United States that we all have to do together around the world, which is to bring those voices together to call for something fundamentally different, which is a different definition of success, a prioritization of well-being, and a fundamental focus on relationships.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this clarity and such an important message. My name's Mark Williamson. I run an organisation called Action for Happiness, which in fact Richard helped co-found, and wearing the badge proudly. My question is about the pandemic that you referred to. We have with Action for Happiness thousands of volunteers out trying to fulfill their version of that answer to your question about what would a successful hustle culture really look like. For us, it's about creating more happiness for others. So they run activities to support well-being in local communities, groups and courses. Now, before the pandemic, that was all happening face-to-face. It was a lovely example of connection in just the way you've been describing. We even had randomized controlled trials showing how much it boosts not only individual well-being, but also social cohesion and trust and kindness and so on. The pandemic led all of that to happen online, and that was very successful. But we've seen, I think, a surprising amount of reluctance for people to re-engage face-to-face post-pandemic, something I've been describing partly as social apathy. So I think there were some really valid reasons why people are doing that. A couple that come to mind. One is genuine fear. I think the pandemic made us more afraid about public health risks to our own health and so on. But there's also something about convenience. People have got into the habit of not going out and meeting in person. And whilst that works for a while, especially for those of us that already had good relationships, I feel there's a huge hidden sort of part of the population that was already at risk of all the challenges of isolation and is now even more disconnected and finding it harder to get back. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on whether you've seen this post-pandemic, but also what we can do to encourage people to see that maybe the trade-off they're making, maybe looking after their health is important, of course, but their social connection is so vital for that as well. What would you advise?
And tell me your name one more time.
Mark Williamson.
Okay. Mark, I mean, first of all, that's a brilliant question, and I think very on point, because what you're describing, and I love the term social atrophy that you're using, is happening all across the United States as well. We actually hear this often from young people who tell us that it just, you know what the term they use is, they say that the pandemic made them, what is the term they use? It's a form of regression, but they say it made them age backward. That's the term that they use in terms of their social comfort and social skill. But it's actually not just kids, right? It's older people as well. I myself have found that I've sometimes have to push myself more to like get out after the pandemic. I got comfortable just zooming into everything and being and not seeing friends and just being in the house. And so I do think that part of the concept that we're trying to convey to folks is that, just like we have muscles that atrophy, with disuse, that there's a social muscle as well that needs to be built up. And if you've ever had the experience of, and I know nobody in this room has ever fallen off of a gym routine, right? So I will say that I have, right? But if you've ever gone to the gym for a while and then like slacked and then gone back after a few weeks, you know that your muscles are sore initially. And sometimes it's just also hard to motivate to go if you've like fallen off the wagon. But it gets better, right? Like you start to build strength, like the more you go, the more you push yourself, and then it actually feels good to go. And this is actually part of why we actually have to recognize that some of that discomfort is okay. We have to push through it and support each other through it. This is important because I do worry that sometimes there's this tendency to say, if it doesn't feel good, don't do it, right? And that means that if it feels a little uncomfortable to go out and talk to people, don't do it, right? Like don't. But I think that's where we have to just help normalize that for people and say, it's gonna feel a little weird, a little uncomfortable, a little strange when we like go and re-engage with people again, whether it's in the workplace, in our neighborhoods, or in school. But it's important for us to do. And I think we have to, in our workplaces and schools, like create time and space for people to have that interaction, particularly without their devices. Because what colleges are doing, universities in the US, is they're trying to create more of that space for people. But young people are actually telling us, they're saying, when we get into those spaces, we feel uncomfortable, so we just pull out our phones, right? And I don't blame them. That's a natural thing. You go to the path of least resistance, like when you run up against resistance, right? But being able to create spaces where people can actually be together without their devices, where they can engage with an activity, they can create some purpose, like service, or like sharing like a story or an idea together, that creates his initial fodder for interaction and can help us rebuild that. So we're all trying to rebuild our social muscle in society, but I think we have to be very intentional about it and set expectations for people that it's going to be a little difficult, but it's actually going to feel a lot better like over time, and we'll all be better off as a result. Thank you, Mark.
1 minute, and therefore a 10-second question from Chris.
Chris Rowan, I was an MP for 21 years. Now I'm a volunteer, full-time volunteer. And the question is, we've mentioned regional government, national government, local government, but in the United Kingdom, we have voluntary sector bodies that encourage volunteering in the community. But are our think tanks, our national government, our local government and regional government in the US or the UK connected enough to that voluntary sector to get people volunteering, to put that social cement back into society that's crumbled over the decades? And Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, one of the best books I've ever read. So your opinion on that, how do we connect with the voluntary sector who deliver on the ground?
Yeah, I think that, well, to your simple answer to your question is no. I don't think government is connected enough to the voluntary sector. I think that for too long, increasingly, I think we've seen that as less important than other sectors like the business sector that the government is very well connected to. But I think if we recognize the value of that volunteer sector in not just improving services and helping people, but in actually helping the volunteers themselves, then I think it's a different metric altogether. So I do think that we need to strengthen that collaboration. I think we need to strengthen the support that goes to those organizations. And lastly, there's also infrastructure that needs to be built between those organizations. Many of the volunteer organizations in society are disconnected from one another, right? They're struggling on their own to raise money, figure out how to run an organization, how to recruit volunteers, how to train them, how to deal with them when challenges come up. These are lessons that they could probably benefit from sharing and learning from each other. I say this as somebody who ran a volunteer organization for many years and find myself thinking about the same things, trying to solve problems that I figured other people have already tried to solve in the volunteer sector. How do I connect with them? This is a place where I do think government can be helpful in laying some of that infrastructure, helping build those connections. The power of government to convene, to bring organizations together for common purpose and to learn from one another is powerful. And this is a space where I think it would be very valuable for them to exercise that power.
Well, this has been a fantastic session. Thank you so much. So we know we want better policies, but we also need cultural change. So thinking about your 6 and 7-year-olds, we don't want them to be building their brand. We want them to be creators of happiness. That's what we are encouraging everybody to be. And I mean, we're rather English, at least I certainly am. We don't find it terribly easy to talk about these most important and basic things. You know, what are we about and what really matters? We feel we have to use words like well-being. We can't use the word happiness because that's too real. and I think what's amazing, and so I just would like to say that we have to actually, in that old-fashioned sense, bear witness. We have to stand up for what we believe in and not be afraid to say it when a lot of nonsense is being talked, as it is all the time around us. And what's amazing is that you have dared to do this in this very exposed position that you're in, and I think that is just tremendous. So very good luck to you, and thank you so much.
Well, that's very kind of you.
Yeah, you're lovely, really lovely session. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this amazing well-being content, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.